Hi, I'm Lori.
And I'm Kevin, and this is No Longer Ashamed.
We are survivors of childhood sexual abuse.
And we're here to share with you that if you're a survivor, you don't have to be alone.
Our logo is a salamander, and the reason is a fire salamander can survive a fire, and you have survived a fire.
We want to help you with your journey to healing and hope.
We are all survivors together, and we walk this journey together, and you are not alone.
By telling our stories, we are hoping that you will have the courage to share your stories as well and find your voice.
Because stories are so important, and for so long I know that I wouldn't tell my story, but when I finally shared my story, that's when I got my freedom.
And this is our journey and your journey to healing and hope. So come with us.
So, what do you want to talk about?
Well, it's funny. I was listening to Nathan's TED Talk, The Power of One, after we did his interview, and he talks about the 6 steps, and one of the steps is toxic masculinity leads to vulnerability. And we did an episode about toxic masculinity, but we haven't done anything about vulnerability, really. We haven't done a episode about that. And I think it's important for all survivors, not just male survivors, but for all survivors. It's hard to let down and be vulnerable because we have to protect ourselves. We put up this guard, but being vulnerable is so important. It leads us to accepting who we are and acknowledging what happened to us. It's how we get to that place of acknowledging that this wasn't our fault. This was done to us, and accepting what we've been through because of it. And that's why being vulnerable, but it's especially hard for men because men, just by, I think, the things we're taught, we try not to be vulnerable as a man. And so it's an even harder step for men survivors.
Yeah. And when you think about vulnerability, it's like all the danger signs are going off. You're going to get hurt. This isn't going to be good. And it's interesting because last week we talked about toxic shame. And one of the things about being vulnerable is if you have complex trauma, so we talked about complex shame, is that you can't necessarily just be vulnerable with everyone and anyone.
Mm-hmm.
Because these are big issues. You really want to find somebody safe.
Yeah.
But there's 2 steps to it. One is finding that person and telling it. But did you watch that video that Charnel just sent me? The woman who wrote The Ballerina?
Yeah. Yes.
So in that video, she said, it really hit me what she said about letting go of all of those things, which means by telling your story, you're going to be calling people out, maybe not like in an aggressive way, but if you say this happened to me, then you're saying somebody did something to you. So you're admitting that. And it really struck me as it's telling your story and being vulnerable, but there's even a deeper level of getting to in your heart, getting to a place where you say, it's not worth it to hold on to try to protect myself or anybody else. And that's where the vulnerability comes in, because that's so scary.
It is. And it's scary for men because they don't want to admit that they're afraid of anything or there's something that scares them. I think men avoid being vulnerable because they are afraid of it and they don't want to admit they're afraid of it. They're afraid of what will happen if they allow those feelings of vulnerability. But feelings are important. Feelings are information, and being vulnerable allows us to feel that hurt place inside of us, that scared place inside of us. And that's so important for a man because most men never cry, all of that stuff. And if they cry, it's for something that isn't about them necessarily. It's something external. Maybe they'll shed a few tears at a movie or something but to cry about ourselves, we always fight against being a crybaby. And that means when you're crying about yourself. But we validate what happened and are hurt inside by being vulnerable. When we're vulnerable, when we're allowing ourselves to feel that hurt and to feel that pain and to cry about it, to grieve about it, it validates it. And it also means that we are honoring what we went through, and we're allowing ourselves to feel that we matter, that we are worth grieving about.
It's almost like we have to get past stigma in order to get to vulnerability. And something that I've been experiencing lately is whether it's being triggered or whatever, but when all of a sudden you feel that kind of panic and that fear, and it's not necessarily anything's happening. Like for me, it's when I'll wake up in the morning and I'll feel just like this intense fear. It's almost like I'm drowning and I'm trying to get to the top for water. And I used to try to get away from it. I jump out of bed and then go read my Bible. And something that I've been doing this app, it's called Pause. It's with John Eldredge. And one thing that he suggests, and also Dr. Caroline Leaf suggests this, is rather than moving out of it and trying to get away from it, because it feels awful, it feels scary. And our brain thinks when we feel scared, our brain thinks it's happening right now. So the brain can't go, wait, that's in the past. You're okay. But to stay with it, and even like John Eldredge says, invite Jesus or invite God into that. And what I recognized is I didn't want to invite God into that. I wanted to get out of it and go to God, which seems like really just a subtle shift. But when I started stopping and letting the feelings be what they are, recognize them and go, okay, I am safe. This feels like crap, but God, come in. Spirit, come in. And be with me in this. It just was something I'd never thought of or experienced. And I really feel like it's helping me in a lot of ways to just say, rather than running. And I don't think I'm a person who runs for, you know what I mean? I tell my story, I share. But also I think in those moments of panic where we're caught off guard, it's easy to just be like, to stuff everything down rather than be like, okay, boy, I'm really feeling scared right now. And I'm looking around my house and there's nothing to be afraid of.
Yeah.
And often I don't even identify what it is, but by inviting God into it, then I get this sense of calm.
It's natural for us to want to run away from what we're afraid of. And it's natural to get to a place where we're not afraid. And that's what you do when you're feeling that, and you just get up and go on with your life and act as if nothing happened, because you can act like nothing happened because you weren't in danger necessarily. You were just feeling that fear. But to stay in that fear is scary. It's
hard. But
it is. It is hard.
But it's good. And I think that is to me, that felt vulnerable to say. We always hear, if, as a Christian, I've heard, we don't have to be perfect or everything before we come to God. God just takes us where we are. But on the other hand, what I found is I was trying to get rid of it. And then go to God. Rather than go, here, God, this is really ugly. And I'm inviting you into it. That just didn't feel very good, but it was a suggestion. And so I tried it, and I feel like it's really making a big difference.
Yeah. You're sharing your vulnerability with God. You're sharing your fear with God. And that's one way to be vulnerable, is to expose your fears, expose what you're being afraid of. And for men, it's really scary to show fear. But when you do, it's when you're bringing your community in and asking. It's almost like asking for help, but you're not necessarily asking for help. You're just asking for them to experience this with you. You're sharing whatever it is you're feeling with them. And men don't do that real well. But when you do, you learn that your feelings are important. Your feelings are valid. And that's why being vulnerable is so important, because those feelings help you get through that grieving process. And also they help you get through your fears, because when you face your fears and experience them, and then you realize you made it through, you survived them, then they're not so scary the next time. And every time you do it, you realize you have those feelings for a reason, but they're not going to control you. They're not going to run your life.
Right. And looking at vulnerability as a practice, it's not a one and done. Okay, I told my story, I'm done.
Uh-huh.
It's a daily practice. And, you know, we've talked about this before. There's fight, flight, fawn, and freeze. So fight, flight, fawn, or freeze. And fawn is often what people will do with captors. They'll do whatever they want.
Yeah.
And try to make them happy so that they won't hurt them. And so when you think about that, you know, when you're in that place and those are the things that you want to do, that's really normal and natural. But if you can stay in it and recognize we don't have to run or we don't have to be paralyzed, because there's times, which we've talked about before too, where you kind of just check out and you just scroll on your phone or whatever. But if you can recognize what's happening and then call a friend or reach out to someone or call your counselor or your coach and be able to share. So like maybe you share your story, but then you share, I just had this incident where I was really scared and I don't know what was going on, but I just feel like I need to tell someone, and that's being vulnerable, because we don't want to, you know, especially if we're in leadership places in our church, we don't want to look like we can't handle thing.
Yeah, but that's how we get through those feelings and learn to not be so afraid of them. And the more you get used to being vulnerable, it's not as hard after you've done it before. It's not as difficult, and it becomes a part of your coping that is a healthy way of coping with these things, rather than the unhealthy ways of coping, which are running away or checking out, or you know, using meds so we don't feel, or using our whatever our addictions are so we're not feeling those feelings, instead of covering them up or hiding from them or running from them to actually feel them. We learn that we can handle those feelings after a while. They're teaching us something about ourselves, and it's something important to us.
And according to Brene Brown, when we learn to be vulnerable, that's where we begin to feel a sense of belonging. And, you know, we talked last week about how when you have bigger trauma, it's not the same as being vulnerable for the average Joe. Say you did something when you were a kid.
Yeah.
You know, I tripped a kid and he broke his nose and I laughed. And then you grow up and you're like, that was horrible. I need to be vulnerable and tell somebody. It's, you know, when something has happened to you, it's a different type of, that's why we always say, find somebody safe. You don't want to just go to your Bible study and share a story when you're first being vulnerable, because it's going to put you in a worse place because people may not know how to deal with it. So you definitely want to find somebody that is safe in the beginning. And then, you know, as you get comfortable with your story and you get past all those kind of like landmarks of, you know, when you first tell it and then you're afraid, and then pretty soon you're telling it, you know, at church, or you're sharing your testimony, but you've learned how to share it in a way that's like, when I work with drug addicts. And so when they first come out, they're like talking about the needles and the living on the streets. And then, you know, okay, now we're taking you to a donor. Let's clean up this story a little, you know, let's tell it in a way that people can receive it. But when we first tell our story, we just got to tell it all. And even if it's writing it in a journal, writing it out, or our friend Nathan, you can email him or Instagram him and write your story and he'll read it for you anonymously.
And he'll read it out loud on Instagram. So it's a way of accepting and acknowledging what we've been through. And that's kind of the beginning of it. And then we get to realize that we didn't deserve it. It wasn't our fault. And that's when you can get past to the point of confidence. That's when we get to the point of confidence in ourselves, realizing that we did do all these things and we had all this self-sabotage, but there was a reason for that self-sabotage, and we own that we did that, but we moved past it. And that's how you start to move past all those issues we've had because of what happened to us and how we handled it.
And even moving out of being the victim. And sometimes that can't happen until you recognize it. Even forgiveness, often that can't happen until we get vulnerable and tell our story, say what happened, tell the truth. And then we can begin to get the freedom and become a survivor versus a victim, because you know, it's not like being a victim is like, oh, you're such a victim. You are a victim. Something happened to you. It's not like a lot of people are like, oh, they're playing the victim. You know, they're just being a whiner. It's not like that. You are the victim until you can recognize what happened to you and get empowered and know that, you know, it wasn't your fault and you didn't deserve it. And then, you know, you begin to get the freedom and all the things that come along with healing.
Yeah. So being vulnerable in a way gives us the reason, or gives us the
wherewithal.
Well, yeah. I'm trying to think of the excuse. I don't think excuse is the right way of putting it, but it allows us to get to healing, because until we're vulnerable, we're not going to allow those feelings at all. We're going to hide those feelings. Mm-hmm. And so if you're hiding those feelings all the time, I mean, you can tell your story, you can, you know, come to that point of realizing something happened to you, but if you're not allowing yourself to feel the feelings and acknowledging them, then we're just bottling it up still. And those feelings need to be experienced. They help you to get to that place of understanding that, you know, what the information you're getting from the feelings, where those feelings are coming from. And I think for me, a lot of it is just acknowledging it and realizing that, yeah, that was really bad and I suffered a lot about it, and I didn't always allow myself to feel like I deserved anything else.
Yeah. And the thing about choosing to be vulnerable is, like, I've heard people go, I'm not having none of that, because it's like you're showing your underbelly, you know, like when dogs will roll over. So people can hurt you.
Yeah.
If you choose to be vulnerable, they can take, and that's why I say find someone safe, but also that's why our self-protection kicks in. And I remember I was in a group, it was a life skills class, and they used to call it sinful self-protection, because we think we're protecting ourselves, but really all we're doing is shutting everybody out.
Yeah, but it's, you know, it's a way we cope, but you can't address that unless you find another way of coping. But being vulnerable is how we get to understand our feelings of fear, understand our feelings of shame, understand, you know, where they're coming from, and recognizing them and getting past them, because we realize we don't have to be afraid anymore. We don't have to be ashamed anymore. Mm-hmm. And we're not being hurt anymore. So we're safe now.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's such a process. And that's why I love it, that there are so many ways for healing. There's many modalities. There's many, you know, there's coaching and counseling. There's tapping, EFT. There's so many ways. So you can find something that really works for you to get yourself free from that, it's holding you captive, because your brain still thinks it's happening until you actually speak the words and let your brain know, wait a minute, that happened. It's in the past.
Yeah, but there's still the lingering effects that if we choose to ignore, they just linger. They stick around. But if you face them and feel those feelings, then you can work through them. You can understand them.
Well,
that's how you get to the point of healing and thriving, is to understand what caused all these feelings and issues you've had.
Yeah. And so when we don't talk about it, we're not vulnerable. We're reacting and we always hear this, act, don't react, but we're reacting. And so often people think, and I see this and I compare it with the people in addiction. They say they may relapse or whatever, they're like, well, I'm only hurting myself. And I'm thinking, are you kidding me? You're hurting your whole family. You're hurting everyone. And we don't recognize that when we go into our shell, when we hide, when we're living in fear rather than getting help and support and speaking the truth of what happened, then we not only do we suffer, and I don't think we have to suffer, and we can let go of the suffering by being vulnerable, but everyone around us suffers. And that's the one thing that I've really noticed in stepping into this work, the people that are like, oh no, they're suffering, they're hurting, they don't want to hurt their family, they're carrying this big burden that's way too big for them to be still carrying, because they think that, I don't know, that maybe they just don't understand that there's healing.
Well, I think a lot of people are afraid of addressing it because they've been bottling it up so long
Mm-hmm.
that it just seems so huge. Those
Yeah.
feelings feel so huge because they've been suppressing them, and
Right.
and so they're afraid of releasing a little bit of pressure. Or just
Yeah.
release it all at once.
I remember feeling like I was so afraid because I thought if I do this, I'm going to cry and I'm never going to stop crying. I honestly
Yeah.
thought I'll never stop crying. And my counselor said, yeah, you'll run out of tears. The body just doesn't make endless tears. And I was like, wow, really?
Yeah. Well, it feels that way at first, and
Yeah.
that's why it's so hard to be vulnerable the first time, because we're afraid of how much feeling there is.
Mm-hmm.
But it's true, you do get past it.
Mm-hmm.
That feeling will go away if you go through it. But if you don't go through it, if you don't experience it, if you don't have, break down and cry, or then it will stay there and get bigger, and the pressure just keeps building. And so it becomes scarier and scarier.
Yeah.
But it is a community thing, because in order to be vulnerable, you can't really be alone and be vulnerable. Although, like you said, when you're sharing it with God, you're sharing it with someone. You have to share vulnerability. And I think that's why it's so scary in a lot of ways, is you don't get to practice it on yourself necessarily.
Well, and I think there's I don't know if it was a saying or a stigma, but ignore it and it will go away. And that's not true.
No.
You can ignore it. It doesn't go away. It causes us to get sick, to be ill, to miss out on things, and not live a life of freedom.
And just
have.
Instead of feeling that fear and so forth, we just feel anxiety. We feel anxious. And so that doesn't go away because we've been bottling up the fears and the shame inside. Mm-hmm. And so the anxiety just lingers.
Yeah. And so being vulnerable and the reason whenever like we talk about it, I get really protective, because I remember somebody I knew went to their pastor and he said to them, don't ever share this with people in the church. They will make your life miserable. I think it was good advice, because I think that particular church would have really? Not handled it, because, they just didn't understand enough. And I think about a time when I was in a Bible study and it was at the women's housing, and it was through our church, but I ended up in the one in the women's housing. And the ladies were like, well, when I used to be a prostitute, I did this all the time. And, now I don't do that anymore. And I was just thinking, oh man, if they shared this vulnerability, if they were like at church right now saying, when I was a hoe, and so that's why I get protective and want people to, yes, be vulnerable, but also be vulnerable with somebody that's safe. First, once you're used to your story, that doesn't matter, because if you say you get up on stage and share your testimony, you don't have any control over who's hearing it. But in the beginning, when you are really vulnerable and you're choosing to be more vulnerable, is like find somebody safe.
Yeah, that's so important. And it's not always the same person necessarily, or the person you're closest with, although generally you would think that, but sometimes it's easier to be vulnerable with someone who can be objective, who doesn't have, like, sometimes, your family members or your spouse, they'll want to protect you. They'll want to try and protect you or cure you or fix it for you. You want someone
not believe you.
Yeah, and that too, which is the worst of all. But they might want to try and fix it, which isn't what being vulnerable is about. You're not being vulnerable because you want someone to fix you. You're trying to work through this feeling. And so sometimes it's better if it's not someone you're closest with, but someone who's going to just understand and listen and support you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the first one is the big step. The first, recognizing, oh my goodness, that happened to me and it wasn't okay. And you start to recognize it. And then, oh, these people were bad people and yet they're my family. Or, you know what I mean? There's so many things when you first start. And so it is a really big step. But when you think about any big thing you do, any new job you start, you know, I went into the radio station the other day and it was all decorated for Christmas and it feels like home to me. But that's after 10 years. And I remember the first day I walked into that radio station. Oh my gosh, it was terrifying, you know, and I'm meeting all these people. So the first time is always going to be hard and scary. And so it's not a one-time thing. It's like, okay, and now you did it and you're probably going to have to do it again because maybe you'll get with a counselor and maybe you'll get in a support group. But just seeing the people that we've witnessed sharing their story. And then on the other side of that, we know some people that are too scared, that are holding it in. And we see that they're suffering and it makes us sad because we know they don't have to suffer.
Yeah. And it is a community thing. I mean, being vulnerable builds closer relationships with the people you're being vulnerable with. And so you're forming this community of healing.
Yeah.
And if you're being vulnerable with them, it's giving them that window, that opportunity to the space to where they can be also vulnerable with you. And so it's kind of a community healing project in a way.
It is. And when I was running the day center for homeless women, all these women would come in and share their story. Well, they didn't know me.
Yeah.
And I was usually dressed up for work. Most of my volunteers just wore jeans and t-shirts, but you know, I had to go to work right after.
Yeah.
And so they didn't know me. And I remember one time, one of them asked me a question and I said, well, I was homeless with 3 kids. And they were absolutely shocked. And I didn't go around saying that to them all the time, but somebody asked, and it was just amazing because I felt like it made them love me even more because they went, oh, she's not just this do-gooder giving us coffee. She's actually been there.
Yeah.
And so it builds community. And sometimes we get removed from our story and we don't tell it as much, but you know, there'll come an opportunity when we share it and people will be like, oh my goodness, I didn't know, you know, and then they understand that you understand them.
And it seems like the older I get, the more I realize the things that really matter to me, it seems the most, are my relationships. And the way you build stronger relationships is by being vulnerable with each other, by being true with each other, by being yourself with others and not hiding those things, even if they're ugly or scary or shameful or you're ashamed of them, or by being real with someone, then they, you know that they really care about you because they know all of, they know the truth about you. And so that's how we build relationships. And that's what, I feel that the most important things in my lives are the people I know and the relationships I have with them. But you don't have a real relationship unless you're able to be vulnerable.
Yeah. And it's hard. And I think for me, something I've been really recognizing is, I think we talked about this in recovery coaching, that healing is not linear. It's not A to B. It's circular. And so sometimes I get to these places and I think, what is happening? And I recognize it's just a deeper level of what I've already been doing.
Yeah.
And so recognizing this whole thing about inviting God in, it's like recognizing that healing is layers and layers. And it doesn't mean like, oh, we're never going to heal, but that there are layers to it and that we get more free. You feel like you're free, but then you get more free, and then you share a little more and you get more free.
Yeah. You keep going deeper and deeper, and you get better at it as you go along because you've been practicing it, and it's not as scary, and you learn how to handle things, and you're learning more about yourself by by examining yourself and
Right.
examining your feelings and examining your issues. And the more you learn about the self, and the more you're willing to share it with others too, because when you just hold it in, you don't share, you're only sharing a little part of yourself, and it's not really you. It's just that part of yourself you're allowing out. But if you're being true to yourself, then you're sharing your whole self with everyone.
I think one of the things about being a survivor of childhood abuse is that it's so insidious because the abuser uses control and coercive control. And so that's why vulnerability is extra hard. So I like how Dr. Zoe Shaw says, there's the run-of-the-mill vulnerability. It's like normal people with normal shame. But when you have bigger shame and bigger trauma, vulnerability is going to be a little harder because there's trust. You've been controlled.
Mm-hmm.
You don't really, it's hard to trust your instinct and your intuition. And that's why by getting in support groups and getting with people, it will really help to kind of untangle that web and help you learn how to trust your instincts and to kind of know how and who you can trust. And I hear women say all the time, well, my picker is broken, meaning they've chosen not great partners in the past.
Yeah.
But also they've learned from that. They've grown. They're involved in self-development and self-growth. And I always go, your picker was broken. But because you've been doing the work in healing, give it another chance. Be vulnerable, even in a new relationship, because you are a different person.
Yeah,
when
growing.
You begin that healing. Yeah.
Yeah, you're growing into what your purpose is and who you were meant to be. And it's really difficult for survivors because we know what it's like to be vulnerable. We know what it's like to be hurt. And I think because of that, we know that vulnerability can be very dangerous.
Yes, risky.
And we've been taught that, it's risky. And so that's why it's so especially hard for survivors to be vulnerable. But it's so important because when you're vulnerable with the right people in the right way, you learn you don't have to be afraid of being vulnerable. And that's complete 180 thought from being what we normally feel when we're a survivor.
Right. Well, we think, I often, I think of shelter dogs, and the thing about dogs, if they've been abused, it's very hard for them to ever trust. So if they've been hit every time, even a loving new owner will raise their hand to pet them, they'll cower thinking they're going to get hit because they don't have that brain process. But that when we don't get help and healing, that's kind of how we're behaving. We think everyone's going to hurt us. But when we begin to get healing, then we recognize there are some people that we can be vulnerable with that won't hurt us, but also we want to be careful because we don't want to just throw our pearls. There's a Bible verse, you don't throw your pearls out before swine. Like in the beginning especially, you do want to be careful. You don't want to not be vulnerable, but you also want to be careful so that you don't get hurt or smacked down,
Yeah, so you have to be selective. You have to be
I like
aware.
that, selective. That's a good word.
Yeah.
Selective, yeah.
And then you learn to trust people more by...
Yeah, because there are safe people.
Yeah, and once you find them and you learn how to be vulnerable, then you realize the risk isn't as great as you thought it was, perhaps, and then you kind of are able to do it more and more.
Well, and we have the self-talk. And so, for instance, I hear this from women who've been divorced, all men. Well, that's not true. All men aren't awful. You may have had a couple bad men in your life, but that doesn't mean all men. And it's the self-talk. And so as we become more vulnerable, rather than all people are going to hurt me, we may not realize we're thinking that. And we will say we can start to change those to there are some good, safe people. There is a community for me. There is a place of belonging. So we can start to say those words and get those feelings by doing the action of being vulnerable.
Yeah, that's where, and that's why the feelings are so important. But you can't understand or recognize those feelings if you're not being vulnerable. You have to be vulnerable. Then you understand and you recognize the feelings you're having. And from those feelings, you can understand where they're coming from. You understand the information.
Yeah.
And so then you learn that why you were feeling that way and how to handle those feelings.
Well, and, when people come out of drug addiction and you think about it, often it is because of childhood abuse. But as they start to heal and get into recovery, they have two emotions, mad or glad.
Mm-hmm.
They're either happy because it's the white cloud or pink cloud. They're all, yes, I'm getting recovery. But then something happens, they get triggered. And instead of acting, they react. And so it's going from learning that there's more than just two emotions, happy and sad and feelings, that there's all kinds of layers and there's all kinds of different feelings. And then as we begin to recognize them, we could name them.
Yeah.
Because like something might go wrong and you're like, oh, I'm so pissed. But really, maybe you'll be like, oh, I can figure this out. Like that didn't go my way, but I can figure it out. We can start to then increase and open up and have more room for more emotions.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of men, anger is the natural response. And like you said, it's a reaction. And a lot of men hide what they're really feeling with anger because they don't want to expose themselves. They don't want to expose that feeling. So they get angry. And so what happens when you experience that feeling and then you get to where it's coming from, you learn more about why you're having those feelings and why they seem so out of control, but you can understand them and control them and be able to deal with them. So it's natural for men to experience just anger because that's a response, but it also protects them from actually exposing what they're really feeling.
Yeah, which is a myth because it's not. But isn't that funny? It's like we think it is. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why men don't want to be vulnerable because they don't want to go there where where that feeling's coming from.
It's like, oh, are you going to make me talk about my feelings?
But it's so important, and it does create community, and it does get you to a place of being able to understand your feelings and accepting them, which is so important.
Do you think for men, and this might be just I might be stereotyping. Do you think for men, like that they have to get to a certain level of pain before they're willing to then be vulnerable and get help? Or do you think, like, what do you think it takes for a man to get to a place?
I think that's often true. And I'm pretty sure it was true for me because, asking for help was so scary because it's hard to admit you need help. And so it's not until it's absolutely unbearable are they going to actually break down and ask for help. But that's the sad part, is waiting so long. If you're able to work on being vulnerable before it becomes just, the last resort, then you can get through those feelings easier. They're not breaking you down. They're not as overwhelming.
Well, and I think knowing that you have a choice. So if you're suffering and you're hurting, you don't have to. So often, I think for me in the beginning, I think I just thought that things were never going to go well for me and I deserved it. And I even thought that as a Christian, suffering was some sort of badge. But when I recognized that suffering was a choice, that I didn't have to be hurting all the time and struggling all the time, that I could actually take action and take control of my life. That's when I went from being a survivor, from a victim to a survivor, when I said, I don't have to suffer anymore.
Yeah, I think I accepted suffering because I felt like I didn't deserve anything else. And I also accepted it because I was afraid to show that I was suffering. I was afraid to show because I didn't want to tell anyone why I was suffering. And so suffering I was stuck on suffering. But when you're vulnerable and you're expressing the feelings that are causing you to suffer, then you can get to the place of healing from that.
Yeah.
I think just the whole process, vulnerability is one of the most important parts of it for a survivor, because if we're not vulnerable, we're not actually addressing things. We're not actually expressing our emotions. We're not, it's really hard, and it isn't always fair, but it's how we get to the place of feeling the feelings and learning where they're coming from. And so I think one of the most important parts of the process is being vulnerable.
And also, we can be vulnerable in baby steps. So we don't have to just go, okay, I'm going to just tell somebody my story. We could say, like, for a long time, I used to say, well, I was raised by wolves, like we don't, we can just do little things, and test the waters with somebody. Like if we know somebody that's safe, we might say, I think my mom was mentally ill, or we could just throw out one little thing and see how they respond to it. And then, it's like, they might be like, mine too. And then you have this awesome conversation and you're like, oh my gosh, wow. But so we can take baby steps. We don't have to just go all out vulnerable, roll on our back. And, like we see this with dogs, right? When the alpha dog is around and the other ones are like, rolling over. It's like, we don't have to totally do that. We can just do baby steps, test the waters, because it is a process. And also the more we do it, then the better we're going to feel. Then we're going to go, oh, I might want to do that again. Oh, I might want to, and then when we start to feel better, that's going to feel weird to feel better, but we'll get used to it and then we'll try it again.
Yeah. And I think that's really important, is to take it a little bit at a time. And that's how you gain confidence in knowing that you're not going to be hurt. It gives you the incentive to be more vulnerable when you find out that you aren't hurt by it and you can actually bring up more.
Yeah. And I would just say too, I want to just put this out here because it's the holiday season, is if you are struggling and you are hurting, there is a crisis line and it's 988 and you can call. Or if you have a partner that's really struggling and you don't know what to do, call 988. Get resources, get help, because I always say there is a light at the end of the tunnel and it's not a train. It's like when you're feeling so desperate and it's the holidays and you're suffering and you're hurting, there is help and hope. And I think many of us have been at a place where our thinking isn't quite right when we're so when we get so depressed. Yeah. And that just to be brave enough to at least call that number, call somebody, get help, have somebody be willing to listen to you if you need that, because, and you're always welcome on our Facebook page to reach out to us. And we try to pay attention and get, answer the messages, but that we don't have to suffer anymore. We don't have to suffer in silence.
Yeah. And that's true. Even if you can't find anyone, if you feel like there isn't anyone safe to talk about with, there is places you can talk about. There's other crisis lines as well. You can contact us.
We've got resources on our webpage. We have a bunch of resources. We just updated everything. Yeah.
We have a list of different crisis lines and so forth that you can reach out if you don't have anyone you feel like you can be vulnerable with. There always is someone you can reach out to, a crisis line, and just tell them what you're going through. And I reach out when you're feeling that way.
Yeah. And I think what's so amazing is when we do reach out. I remember when I finally got into counseling and I would tell my counselor something and she would say, oh, well, you know why that happened, or you know why you feel that way. And I'd be like, what are you talking about? And then she would tell me, like, there's so many things so like when we've heard of Al-Anon, if you're raised by an alcoholic parent, there's a lot of things, like you have a hard time making commitments. There's like this whole list of things and you read through them and you're like, wait a minute, how do they know me? So when you've had childhood trauma, there's all these things that you think are just yours. You think you're the only one that thinks that way or feels that way. And you get in with a counselor or coach or other people and they're like, oh yeah, that happened to me too. Or, there's just so many things that we don't even know are a symptom of the abuse.
Yeah.
And then when we understand it, we're like, oh, that's why. And everything makes sense and we can move on to the next step.
Yeah. But it starts with being vulnerable.
Yeah.
And it gets easier
it does.
after you practice.
After you freak out a little first time and you're going to freak out, but it's okay. Yeah. That's part of the process.
It's so much more important. And I think it's so important for men, especially when they're dealing with toxic masculinity, if they're stuck in that place of always being a man, always being tough, always protecting themselves, doing whatever it takes.
Yeah.
If you can find a place of countering that, of being vulnerable, being safe about being vulnerable, then you learn to be who you really are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're not asking you to be a victim. It's not that vulnerability is very different, because vulnerability is a choice.
Yes.
And you can choose to be vulnerable with somebody safe.
So that's it for today.
We are going to have a prayer time if you want to stick with us. If not, we believe in you.
We want to hear from you. We want to hear your stories.
If you like this podcast, please rate and review, because that's how other people can find us. And we really want to spread this message.
Father, thank you for all your blessings, especially for the blessing of your persistence in our lives and your gift of vulnerability, that you allow us to be vulnerable with you. And in doing that we learn how to be vulnerable with others, Lord. And I just pray for anyone listening that they would feel safe to come to you with everything that they're going through, Lord, with even the things they're afraid of, they're ashamed of. Lord, I just pray that they would feel free to share with you, and that you would be there for them, and you would understand and protect them and keep them safe, Lord. And I just pray that they would find a safe place to be vulnerable with others and learn how to share all their feelings that they're experiencing that are confusing or scary or making them angry, but they don't understand why they're angry, Lord. I just pray that they would have a safe place to share those feelings and be vulnerable, especially for the men who have never experienced vulnerability. I just pray that they would take that risk and learn to have the courage. It takes great courage to be vulnerable. And Lord, I just pray that the men would find that courage and find the way to be vulnerable with someone that's safe. In your name I pray.
Father, I think of in the Bible where it says the great reversal, the first will be last, the last will be first. And it seems like so many topics we talk about are not, it's not our human nature to be vulnerable, to forgive. All the things that we say to do for healing don't feel like the natural thing to do. They feel like the opposite of like, I'm not going to forgive them, or they'll think they're off the hook. But Lord, that when we can do the great reversal, and that we can give up to ourselves and to others and become part of a community of people who are healing, that there is so much grace and mercy and love and freedom. And, Lord, when we stay stuck in these patterns of victim, it's hard to feel not only your love, but the love of the people around us. And so, Lord, I pray for freedom. I pray that even though it doesn't make sense, even though it feels almost the opposite of what we should do, that you would help us to recognize that it is your gift to be vulnerable, to forgive, to all the things that will take us into healing. And that, what you want for us is freedom. Some people think, I have to suffer for Christ. Well, suffering comes regardless. We don't have to choose suffering. We can choose freedom. And I thank you for that. I thank you that there is a path out of this. There is a way out. And I think if there is anything that Kevin and I would hope for our listeners, that they would find their way out, that they would realize that there is hope and freedom, and there's a wonderful life waiting for them. And thank you that you are a good, good God. In your Son's holy name, amen.
Man.